Hi there and welcome to this week's demo and lesson. So this week's project that I'm going to ask you to have a go at is using a grid. And I thought probably the best way to explain this to you is just to do a demonstration myself. So as you see, in the past I've used transfer methods. When we did portraits, I did the one where you rub on the back. But gridding is a sort of tried and tested way of transferring an image to be drawn. Now, what I suggest that you try to do this week in terms of picking reference material is I've tried to pick a scene that's got quite a lot of visual information in. And I think this is where the gridding will come into its own. It's a great way for tackling subjects that you just would feel perhaps overwhelmed with if you were just going to draw them by hand. So yeah, I picked a nice busy scene and I think that's what would work really well for this project today. If you just did an open field with skies, that wouldn't matter. Anyway, you can see I've laid out my grid. They're just 2 centimetre squares. One thing I was doing there is you can number your squares, say down the side and across the top, give them letters. That means each square has like A1, A2, A3. That can make it easier when you're transferring. Now, what I've done here to transfer is, so once you've established your grid and your number of squares on your reference material, you then go over to your page and you recreate. Now, what I did with this is I've created a distortion grid. And that means what I've done is I've drawn the squares in a sort of random and haphazard manner. This is in order to create a sort of a looser, more abstract finish. Okay. Now, as it happens, I think in some respects I bit off a little bit more than I could chew with this exercise. Doing the distortion grid itself did become a lot more challenging. And in fact, I would say, although I was quite pleased with the end result, you know, you learn from all of these things, and doing the distortion grid it might work better for simpler subjects, or if I was drawing at a much bigger scale. But at this level, because some of the squares became so small, what happens is you end up really just drawing it effectively as you see it. Now, unfortunately, I've had to skip ahead there because the video sort of cut out. But as you can see, what I did is I started to go down one column at a time, just trying to get all those little details in. Okay. Now the distortion that I've added, as you can see, it's very slow, painstaking work. That's why I have speeded this up quite considerably for you this week, because I think you would get bored doing this. I mean, it's a great technique. Certainly some artists use it to create photorealist effects, and if you're a bit more thorough than me and really spend time getting each square as accurate as possible, you know, you can really reproduce a photograph with incredible accuracy using this. But yeah, so I went through, I'm using a biro there, and so when you do a distortion grid, you're basically taking the information that's in a square and you're trying to then transfer that into what might be a sort of larger rectangle. So it takes a little bit of mental gymnastics, and that's why I was saying that what I would suggest for you to have a go at this week is, first of all, just do a straightforward like for like copy. So you could maybe change the scale. So instead of like go from a 2 centimetre square to a 3 centimetre square, or just do a like for like copy. Okay. I say there's lots of things you can do with the grid to make the exercise more creative than just doing a transfer. You can do things like where you shuffle all the squares around, or you know, you change the ratio of the squares, or like I've done here, you create a distortion. So one of the reasons I was keen for you to have a go with this is because I think it's useful to learn the gridding technique anyway for transferring images. But also, you know, you can use it in a very creative way. There's lots of avenues to play around with it. If you know Chuck Close, the American artist, he used grids to do sort of photorealistic portraits. And if you get the chance, look at Chuck Closer's work, and he got amazing results by sort of blowing up almost like passport photographs of people, but just the scale made them amazing. Anyway, so as I say, I forwarded it for you for a bit because it's very sort of slow going, especially with that distortion effect. As you can see, it made the chap on the cycle in the front. I ended up making him a lot wider. But yeah, so you know, there's not masses for me to say here, but just again, you take on a nice complex subject and then just take your time. You know, one square at a time if need be. And then what I did is I added a tonal wash. Once I'd established, I'd drawn all my shapes for each square. And what I've used here is water-soluble graphite. So Derwent make these pencils. But again, you know, you could just do it by pencil, pen, watercolour. You know, you've got plenty of options for taking your drawing a bit further. But with this approach, I'm just basically sketching in those tonal masses and then use a brush afterwards. So yeah, my hope is that you will get out there and it will give you the confidence to take on subjects that otherwise you might have found a bit daunting. Particularly like, you know, buildings, very complex scenes, or even people and faces is a good one for gridding. And if you do feel inclined to do a distortion grid, then, you know, have a go. When the information in a square becomes very complex, you can actually make your drawing of it more accurate in a grid by actually adding a diagonal cross in the square on your reference, and then on your where you're going to do the drawing will make the process a bit easier if you get a lot of complex information. So there you can see this is the water-soluble graphite. So as you can see, this carries on a little bit from some of my talks on tone. So I've really simplified my tones. Just most of the buildings are relatively dark and there's two white lighter buildings, but my first wash was basically to establish my mid-tone. So I knew it wouldn't go that dark because it would sort of dilute slightly, but that establishes the mid-tone and the lights, and then I go on a bit later to add some darks. So yeah, the mind plays tricks on you. Even though it was a distorted grid, you know, your brain is still basically trying to draw it as accurately as possible. So yeah, there's a bit of an art to using the distortion grids. But other things you could do is you could colour in one square in blue, another square in orange. So you could play around with colour differences in each square. Different media in different squares. So again, lots of ideas there that you could play with. But I think you'll probably get the most out of it by just doing a straightforward copy initially. So as you can see, having established my mid-tone, I'm now going back in with the pencil and going back into the darks. So it's a bit like I talked about using, or trying to think of your art really in about 3 levels of tone. So that's sort of the thought process that's going on there. And also, I was also thinking a little bit of, you know, the lesson I did on texture. So, you know, to make your drawing interesting, you know, find textures. So there were some nice sort of bricks, the tiles on the roof, the leaves. All of those things add variety and will sort of create interest in the painting or the drawing. Yeah, so if you've got a very sort of meticulous mindset, you know, it's almost like when I started doing the drawing, it's almost like taking on a 1,000-piece puzzle. So you really have to settle in and just pace yourself to really try and, you know, to be patient, not to jump ahead. It's actually very easy to get lost with this exercise, to forget what square you're on. So that's why it might be, you know, it might take you a couple of goes to get the hang of it. But persevere and you'll be amazed. You know, you can get amazing results using a grid. So it's just another tool that you can have in your repertoire as an artist going forward. And I quite like the distortion because, you know, it's not all the time that you want to you know, create something that is like a photo replica. I quite like with the urban sketches, you know, the distortions of perspective, sort of wiggly lines, you know, breaking things up. It adds a bit more interest, I think. So that's something to just bear in mind if you want to play with your subject a bit more. Now, I did my initial grid using a red pencil. So it's another thing is often an artist will disguise the fact they've used a grid. It's almost like giving the secrets away. But some artists have also incorporated the grid as basically a graphic element. So by leaving it red, I actually quite like that. I thought it just added interest to the drawing. So that's up to you there. Anyway, so I did speed this whole exercise up sort of quite considerably for you. So there isn't, you know, there's not bags of information this week, but hopefully that is going to give you something to have a go with. And hopefully you will enjoy using a grid. Anyway, feel free to email me if you have any questions. Otherwise, look forward to seeing how you get on. And I will see you again soon. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Bye.